Well, good morning everyone. It's a great pleasure to be able to give a talk here at summer school, and not the first one I've given at summer school, but it's always an excitement. Bigger numbers than we usually get at lodges, and more of an energy, I think, as well. And this particular talk was summarized in the program, headed the concept of God, which you'll see is quite complex. We are told in the Mahatma letters that the concept of God is an acquired notion. It arises out of man's desperate curiosity and need to know from where he comes, and to explain the mystery of human self-consciousness. Within Theosophical doctrine, there are answers which surpass all those offered by man-made religion. The God of the theologians is simply an imaginary power which has never yet manifested itself. As Moyne said, I start from a biblical background long before I came to Theosophy. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But it's perfectly clear for those who read the Bible intensively, as I did for many decades of my life, that the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament. The characteristics of the God of the Old Testament are really quite horrific. There are times when he instructs Moses and the children of Israel to indulge in genocide, to spare no one from the sword, when he displays a vindictiveness which is unbelievable. And the contrast with the God of the New Testament, as projected by Jesus, is so great that it can't be the same person, can't be the same God at all. Neither does it have credibility. Anyone who believes in goodness, truth, and beauty, the three traditional divine attributes, cannot reconcile the God of the Old Testament to that. And he never revealed himself. The one occasion which stands out in the Old Testament where Moses pleads with God, having been attracted to God by the burning bush that was not consumed by the flames, he says to God, "Let me see thee." And God says to him, "I will put my hand across your eyes, you shall not see me until I have passed by. You can see my back, but you can never see my face." And of course no one was ever told what happened when Moses met God on Mount Sinai. He was given the 2 tablets with the 10 commandments, but whether he saw God there or not is another matter altogether. However, there's one thing to be noted about the descent of Moses from Sinai with the 10 commandments, and that is that the children of Israel, we're told, couldn't look upon him when he came down. He had seen or been indwelt or energized by something that made his whole personality and physical body a shining light. And some of us, of course, have seen a little glimpses of that shining light in our own lives. The shining light which shone from Moses' face was called the Echinea, and it was unbelievable, and it lasted for a very long time. It put the children of Israel in awe. And the later prophets of the Old Testament made a tremendous effort to persuade the children of Israel there were no other gods but the God of the Israelites. Because it was a huge psychological boost to go into battle believing that you had a real God on your side, whereas the other side didn't have anything at all really. And there was the challenge of the on the altar, where the flames came down and licked up the sacrifice from the God of the Israelites. Nothing happened when the followers of Baal cut themselves and sacrificed themselves and did everything they could to engender some sort of response from their God. And in fact, engendering some sort of response from God has been a major preoccupation of man down through his history. He's tried somehow or other to get a glimpse of a reality which was so strong and powerful that it would explain himself and his life and everything that I mentioned there in that introduction. Most of the time, it's been a complete failure. None of these so-called gods have actually manifested themselves in any way at all. In fact, we're driven into a situation, looking back historically, that most people indulge in a piece of self-deception. It's a horrible thing to have to say, but I believe it to be true. In fact, the followers of man-made religion have to have a considerable ability to indulge in self-deception in order to stick with it. And we are driven to this strange ephemeral substance called faith, because we can't explain it, because we don't see it, because we don't hear it, because we don't sense it in any way. We're told we need faith. We have to accept what we can't account for in our observation of the world around us. And it's not a good position to be in. And I was in that position, I think, with Christianity for something like 30 or 40 years of my life. And eventually, in my early 50s, I began to get restless. Here was I, a professional scientist and engineer, relying totally upon the scientific method and the an analytical approach to solving problems, and indulging in what became more and more to me a piece of self-delusion. I know it's very uncomfortable to have to say these things, and no doubt in a previous century I would be burnt at the stake, or at the very least excommunicated. But really, I don't fear either of those things today. I wouldn't particularly like to be burnt at the stake, I must admit, but truth is the paramount thing. And so it happened one day that I came to summer school some 24, 25 years ago and met Theosophy for the first time. And for those of you who are here for the first time this morning, I'm going to recount a little bit of what happened to me. I was deluged with new ideas, encased very often in new words that I'd never met before, technical words which I needed to have an explanation for, and which I stood up and asked explanations for in the meetings. Made a bit of a nuisance of myself, really, I suppose. And suddenly I realized that there was a whole new world out there, intellectually and spiritually, which I hadn't even dreamed of. Unbelievable. And then I heard about this extraordinary book called The Secret Doctrine. Now somebody in this summer school came up to me and said, "Why is it called The Secret Doctrine?" And I said, well, it's certainly not because it's secret, because you can go into any bookshop and order it. So how is it secret? Well, it's secret because it's difficult to perceive what is being said in it. It's difficult to read. It's difficult to concentrate your mind. It's difficult because you've only got to read half a dozen pages to realize that you need a key, that you need to understand the meaning of the words that are used, that you need a whole load of background knowledge to understand what's being talked about, which you haven't got. And it's highly, highly inhibiting. In fact, it's so inhibiting that I didn't touch the Secret Doctrine for 2 or 3 years after I came into the Theosophical Society. I was really, I have to be honest with you, I was scared of it. I thought there must be an easier way in. And I listened to lectures, lots and lots of lectures. I read various other books, including The Key to Theosophy, which is one of my favourites. And eventually, I opened The Secret Doctrine. Now, I'm one of these people, when I pick up a book, I really, really want to know everything about the beginning of the book. I read inside the front cover on the title page. I read the introduction, any notes there are about the author. I read everything before I get to chapter 1. So there was I, opening The Secret Doctrine at the front cover. And almost in the front cover, Blavatsky says, my aim in writing this book is to do a synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. Now that really took me by the ears, that did, because although I went through 34 years of scientific research and wrote a huge number of scientific papers, I didn't always write them in the same style, because I was sent off on occasions to weekends away to study the latest style in writing scientific reports. It changes almost as much as women's fashions. And I had to be abreast of the latest way of presenting things. But there was one thing that never ever changed, and that was to put down the aim of what you were doing. If you didn't put down the aim in simple language, you might as well not even start. If you hadn't got a clear mind as to what you were trying to do, you might as well not start. And here was Blavatsky saying right at the very start, her aim, which endeared her to me no end. And I thought, well, now I must be getting fairly near chapter 1, but I wasn't. But there was this strange thing called a proem before chapter 1, and I thought, well, I have to read this proem. Can't possibly look at chapter 1 until I've read this proem. It's my belief that it's one of the most outstanding essays ever written in the English language. It is so brilliant, and written by a person whose first language was Russian. A brilliant piece of essay writing. And as you've already heard at this summer school, not once, but I think twice in previous lectures, the climax of this amazing proem is the presentation of 3 fundamental propositions. Now, they are propositions. They're not articles of faith. You don't have to believe them to be a theosophist. In fact, you're not even asked to believe them. All you're asked is to consider them as a possibility, that they might just answer the big questions you've got about life and existence and consciousness. That's all you're asked to do. They're propositions for debate, for you to consider for yourself. You have to make them your own. You don't have to accept them like the Apostles' Creed, or the Nicene Creed, or the Athanasian Creed, or whatever creed you care to talk about. You're not expected to do anything other than consider them. And they are just propositions. They're not prepositions, as someone said at a lecture at headquarters not that long ago, and I squirmed in my seat. I nearly said something, but in the end I thought, well, perhaps it's worth bringing attention to it than to say anything. So untypically I said nothing. But there are prepositions. They're not prepositions, they're propositions. They're propositions that are put to everybody who comes to Theosophy. Whether or not they come to join the Theosophical Society or not is another matter. But they come to Theosophy, the first thing you're asked to do is to consider them. When I got to this first fundamental proposition, which, although it's been read to you before, there may be people who weren't here before, and I need to read it again for the purpose of my talk. An omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle, upon which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception, could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. It is beyond the range and reach of thought. In the words of the Mandukya Upanishad, unthinkable and unspeakable. Blavatsky goes on to say, to render these ideas clearer to the general reader, let him set out with the postulate that there is only one absolute reality, which antecedes all manifested and conditioned being. Now, it's terribly, terribly difficult. At least I think it is. It was for me. It is for me. Still is for me. To get away from this concept of an anthropomorphic God. Even if I can discount the Old Testament and put it to one side and said, well, that was a tribal God which has got nothing to do with modern theology. I've got this terrible problem of the New Testament, where somehow or other Jesus describes God not just as a supreme being and a heavenly Father, but uses this terrifyingly intimate word, Abba, which in the original Aramaic meant daddy. How do you come to terms with the idea that God is daddy? I mean, it doesn't bind. And these terrifying words from the cross, Father, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now some people try and excuse those words by saying, well, he was only reciting the Psalms as he'd done all his life, and it's the beginning, as some of you know, of Psalm 22. But it leaves a terrible feeling in your stomach, really, when you hear those words read from the pulpit on Good Friday. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with the unimaginable, unknowable, unthinkable, totally unvisualizable, if I can say that, God that's behind the scenes, a God like all the other gods that never manifests. Or does it? Never manifests. Hey, don't say I've left it behind. No, it's the Anthony Hoskins book. Now, for anyone who really wants to know what the foundations of esoteric philosophy is all about, you cannot do without this book. In fact, this book is so superb that Howard Tarn, whom we remember with great loving remembrance, who is such a powerful force in the summer school for so many years, is now just a bit too old to come anymore, insisted that every member of the society was sent a copy of this book. Anthony Hoskins, who, like me, did 9 years as president, wrote this book. She was head of a teacher training school, and she knew exactly what she was on about. And she produced this book, which is all about coming to the Secret Doctrine. And this is what she put in her own notes. She says, in the Bowen notes, Madame Blavatsky advises the student that the first thing to do, even if it takes years, is to get some grasp of the three fundamental principles given in Proem, the masterly prelude to the Secret Doctrine. The statement of the three principles is introduced with a similar insistence on their primary importance, and again in concluding their presentation, Madame Blavatsky affirms that these are the foundation ideas of the Theosophical tradition. In fact, these three fundamental propositions are the foundation stones upon which all theosophical thinking is based, and which supports all theosophical thinking which is genuine. The Secret Doctrine, she says, in large part, a commentary on selected standards from an ancient work, the Books of Dizan. Following modern usage, the title of her book is always given in italics, while her reference to the age-old esoteric philosophy are left as in the original tradition of the Secret Doctrine. There was a statement that you really can't do without these three fundamental propositions. You need to make them your own. But if you make them your own, what are you making your own? Here we're told there's something that you can't visualize, you can't think about, you can't see or believe in any physical way whatsoever. And it occurred to me the other day that you can get at this absolute, even though it's unthinkable, by a negative process, if I can call it that, by a process of subtraction. If you write down everything which the absolute is not, and you keep on subtracting and subtracting, you don't get to the absolute. Of course you don't. Of course you don't get to the absolute, but you're left in the sort of frame of mind which you need to be in to grasp this first fundamental proposition of the unknowable one that lies behind all existence. So, although I don't really like reading very much in my lectures, I really am going to give you something which I think will show you in a sort of poetic way the way in which you can do this subtraction. I might, if you want me to, read it twice, but it's 2 or 3 minutes, so I probably won't. So I'll read it at a medium speed. I am neither ego nor reason. I am neither mind nor thought. I cannot be heard nor cast into words, nor by smell or sight ever caught. In light and wind I am not found, nor yet in earth and sky. Consciousness and joy incarnate, bliss of the blissful am I. 5 more of these verses. I have no name, I have no life, I breathe no vital air. No elements have moulded me, no bodily sheath is my lair. I have no speech, no hands and feet, nor means of evolution. Consciousness and joy am I, and bliss in dissolution. I cast aside hatred and passion, I conquered delusion and greed. No touch of pride caressed me, so envy never did breed. Beyond all faiths, past reach of wealth, past freedom, past desire, consciousness and joy am I, and bliss is my attire. Virtue and vice, or pleasure and pain, are not my heritage. No sacred texts, nor offerings, nor prayer, nor pilgrimage. I am neither food nor eating, nor yet the eater am I. Consciousness and joy incarnate, bliss of the blissful am I. I have no misgivings of death, no chasms of race divide me, no parent ever called me child, no bond of birth ever tied me. I am neither disciple nor master. I have no kin, no friend. Consciousness and joy am I, and merging in bliss is my end. Neither knowable, knowledge, nor knower am I. Formless is my form. I dwell within the senses, but they are not my home. Ever serenely balanced, I am neither free nor bound. Consciousness and joy am I, and bliss is where I am found. Now, for me, that says a great deal about the One and about our ability to come close to an understanding of the oneness. And there's another little note in Yancey Hoskin's little book about clay. Now, I wouldn't have really expected to have found this idea about clay particularly helpful, but when I read it, discovered it was. Let me see if I can read it to you. Perhaps it would be better if I didn't read it to you. Perhaps it would be better if I just told you what it is. What she's basically saying is this. If you take a lump of clay, you could make it into almost anything. Make it into a cup and saucer, into a plate, into a vase, into a beautiful statuette of the Virgin Mary. You could make all sorts of things out of this clay. But whatever you make of it, it's still the original clay in substance. May have got some of the water baked out of it in the oven, but I mean, it's basically still clay. And she uses that to try and explain how we can look at the One permeating all existence. Because, as the psalmist says, we are made of clay. We're all made of the same substance. If you analyze all our bodies, they're carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, bits of sulfur and iron, all the basic chemical elements of the periodic table are there in some degree or other, playing an important part in the healthy operation of our physical bodies. And this is all an analogy for what happens on the spiritual plane. Try and transfer these thoughts into the spiritual plane, because those thoughts are so important if we're going to get any sort of glimpse of the divine. Now, when I read what I've just read to you, the first of the fundamental propositions, it was suddenly I was almost blinded by the whiteness of the light that shone around it. It was a moment of intense illumination and realization. That I realized that somehow all my life I'd been looking for that statement. And that first fundamental proposition was to me an opening, a doorway to walk through into a new world of thinking and understanding. And the point is also made in the various notes I've got here from quotations that we don't really manage to successfully pursue the idea of brotherhood, do we? We really don't. I mean, I know we've got the TOS, I know we've got these special projects in other parts of the world, but basically, by and large, even within our own society, we don't make much of a go at brotherhood. And a distinction is drawn in the literature between the brotherhood that's based upon the awareness that we're all made of the same clay and the same substance, and the same materials, and the spiritual. If we realize that we're all part of the one, that makes a huge difference to the way we look at each other. And this enables me to introduce the idea of consciousness. Now, consciousness, we're told, is derived from the absolute, from the one that lies behind all existence, which is unimaginable and unknowable and unthinkable and all the rest of it. And it's derived from something called absolute consciousness. Now, I don't know, and I don't suppose anybody here knows, what absolute consciousness is. Because it's part of the absolute, it is beyond the range and reach of human thought, and it's certainly beyond the range and reach of my thought. All I know is that somehow my consciousness is derived from the absolute consciousness of the one, and that everyone else's consciousness is also derived from it. Now, unfortunately, there are 7 states of consciousness, and Blavatsky gives us these 7 states of consciousness in the Secret Doctrine, page 575. The 7 states of consciousness, which I won't read to you because it's too much of a distraction in a talk like this, but it starts with the physical consciousness, and through the grades of 7 it goes finally to the spiritual consciousness, which is entirely, she says, conscious apperception, because it reaches the higher self-conscious manas. Now, if all this teaching about the one and the absolute and consciousness passes you by, it's because we have to raise our awareness into these higher levels of consciousness. Until we've actually developed the ability to be conscious at this level of our being, we will not perceive that sort of consciousness. She calls it the 7 scales or shades of consciousness. The whole of the after-death states teaching in Theosophy depends directly upon whether we actually manage to raise our consciousness into our higher selves during the earth life. If we don't, we just come back and do it all again. And maybe most of us have to come back, and have come back again and again to accept this challenge to raise our consciousness into our higher selves. And somehow this moment, the first time I ever read the first fundamental proposition about the one, eternal and absolute, there was something triggered in me, which I don't think had ever been triggered before. It was a moment of supreme experience, and I should never forget it. It's not the only experience I've had others, but you've heard those, some of you, sometimes in other situations. It was an amazing experience. There's a very uncomfortable feeling, at least it is for me, to feel that the consciousness that I have at the higher levels of consciousness is part of God. That this, again in the Secret Doctrine, page 475, talking about this whole business of going within to find an awareness of the one. She says, enough has been said to show that while for the Orientalists and profane masses the sentence Om Mani Padma Hum means simply oh the jewel in the lotus, esoterically It signifies, oh my God within me. See, it suddenly has a entirely different meaning. Yes, she says, and daring to use this word God with all its anthropomorphic vibrations, but being compelled to in this situation, she says, yes, there is a God in each human being, for man was and will become God. The sentence points to the indissoluble union between man and the universe. For the lotus is the universal symbol of cosmos, spelt with a K, as the absolute totality, and the jewel is spiritual man or God. Now, those of you who haven't come across the Secret Doctrine very much yet need to know that the word cosmos in this quotation is spelt with a K at the beginning, because Blavatsky makes a differentiation between cosmos spelt with a C and spelt with a K. Now, cosmos spelt with a C is all about the physical universe. Cosmos spelt with a K is all about the total universe. The universe which includes not only the physical plane with its myriads and uncountable numbers of stars and space, but also about the spiritual, the subjective realms, of which there are 6, and which form a lattice into which you slot the teachings of Theosophy, rising to the highest one where your consciousness is able to resonate with the divine. She says on the next page, no, on another page altogether, in the Key to Theosophy, in a different book altogether, she says, there is a spiritual consciousness, the monastic mind illumined by the light of Buddhi, that which subjectively perceives abstractions. That's pretty good, isn't it? You've got a mind that subjectively perceives abstractions. And the sentient consciousness, the lower monastic light, the 5 inputs to our brains, of which there are really 6, because in addition to the input from our 5 physical senses, there is the input from our imagination and mind and our thought processes. So there are really 6, in fact there are probably 7, because finally there's the intuition itself, which is the gateway into another layer of understanding. She says, this latter consciousness is held in subjection by the brain and physical senses, and being in its turn equally dependent on them, must of course fade out and finally die with the disappearance of the brain and the physical senses. So you're going to lose a fair amount of your consciousness when you die, there's no doubt about that. It is only the former kind of consciousness, whose root lies in eternity, which survives and lives forever, and may therefore be regarded as immortal. Everything else belongs to passing illusions. So this whole subject is relevant to us, not only as we live this physical life and answer some of our curiosities about why we're here and what we're supposed to be doing here and what the whole game is all about, but it's about also the next life, whether we have a foothold in eternity or not. And of course you may remember that K.H. was very sensitive about this in the Mahatma letters. He says he'd been asked by, I think who's writing us the letter, Sinnett, he'd been asked to do something which strangely, we're never actually told what it was that he was asked to do, but he was appalled, because what he was asked to do somehow just didn't seem right to him, for him to do it. Whether it was to use his occult powers in a selfish way or what it was, we shall never know. But he says these incredible words, which are really engraved on my brain forever. He says, I couldn't possibly do what you asked me to do, because if I did, I would put at risk my hard-won immortality. If I did, I would put at risk my hard-won immortality. And I think that says so much, doesn't it? It's a fragile flower. Maybe it's a fragile lotus flower. I don't know. We did the lotus flower mudra in the yoga class this morning. It's a fragile flower, this grasp of eternity. And yet I'm sure that most of us would like to have it. And strangely, it brings in a whole raft of other questions. Where is this place that I go to where I die, when I die? What is it that happens to me that I'm still somehow conscious without my physical body? All these sorts of questions come rearing up at you if you're taking it seriously. I mean, if you're playing it, the game that man-made religions play, where you say, oh, you don't worry about all that, just believe. Just believe. Don't worry about it. But I'm afraid I'm not that sort of person. I want to know. I want the evidence. All the way through my career, it was evidence that mattered to me. If I couldn't see why nature behaved the way she did, I would do almost anything to find out how I could find the way to understanding her behavior. Now, there is, as some of you know who've heard me talk about the key to Theosophy before, a fantastic statement by Blavatsky on page 178 of the key to Theosophy. And she says, dealing with some of these questions, I won't go into all the detail, I haven't got time to. She says, we have our own doctrine ready. To us, it offers no difficulty. Her mind was as clear as a bell. She knew exactly where she was and where she was going, and how the whole thing fitted together like a beautiful jigsaw puzzle. She says, and these are dramatic words, she says, the clue lies in the double consciousness of our mind. The double consciousness of our mind. And also in the dual nature of the mental principle. Now, that would be enough to make a major sermon of 25 minutes in church, because it's so pregnant with meaning. The double consciousness first. We'll look at the dual nature of the mental principle second. The double consciousness. We have two levels of consciousness automatically. Apart from rising up to the higher levels of consciousness, we have this too. We have the consciousness which we're so familiar with all the time, that's taking in the six different signals from different parts of our body's awareness of its surroundings and itself. We also have the consciousness of our higher self. And it's amazingly easy to discover that you possess this double consciousness. And I've had people come up to me after saying this in a lecture, enthusiastic about it, about how they've experienced it. This double consciousness that she talks about. Somehow you're doing one of the ordinary things, like peeling potatoes, or cleaning your shoes, or cleaning your teeth, something that is so routine that you can really hand over to your ROM, to some program somewhere embedded in your hypothalamus or something, which enables you to do it without thinking about it. And while you're doing it, your mind wanders off and thinks about something else. And you finish cleaning your teeth, and suddenly you realize that you've been miles away. And I've had people come up to me and say, I drove several miles down the road the other day, and I can't remember a single thing about what happened because I was thinking about something else. One half of the mind was doing the ordinary, everyday things. The other half of the mind had gone off thinking about something else altogether. Blavatsky says that that other bit that goes off thinking about something else is the bit that is the real self-consciousness, because you can then look in and say, why did I think all that? Or why didn't I put enough toothpaste on the brush? You know, I mean, because you can suddenly criticize the actual processes of your own mind. And this is crucially important, because it goes hand in hand with the second half of this sentence, which says, in the dual nature of the mental principle. The dual nature of the mental principle. While we are living our ordinary everyday lives, we can go off into another world of experience and imagination. And if we're really lucky, we will go into this world where the intuition is fired up. We start to see things which we thought to myself, why didn't I ever think of that before? Why didn't I ever think of that before? When I got this thing from the IE, I remember exactly what happened. I was sitting at my desk at work, gazing out of the window, watching what was happening inside my brain. So I was just using my eyes to look out at the fields outside the window and watching what was happening in my brain. And gradually, something appeared in my brain which hadn't been there before. It was weird. And I saw that it had huge implications. I was able to actually grasp it while it was in focus before it disappeared, and actually take hold of it and use it. And it was incredibly useful. And if anyone wants to know more about it, I'll tell you later. Which reminds me of something that Christmas Humphreys said in his little book, The Search Within. Because what this is all about the nature of God, is all about the search within. Because that's the only place that you can find any answers to your questions about God. Within your mind. And he says in his book, intuition does not need to be consciously developed, but rather released from within. If I haven't said it already, and I don't think I have, I mean, the challenge to go down this particular road of understanding and illumination is a challenge to us to develop our mind and thought processes, to give ourselves time in silence and quietness and peace to see these thoughts develop within our own consciousness. The clue, she says, lies in the double consciousness of our mind and in the dual nature of the mental principle. But the other clue, which she mentions elsewhere, is the setting aside of time to be quiet and to allow ourselves to watch our minds think. Not listening to what someone else has thought, like you are now, or listening to something someone is saying on the television or reading the newspaper, but just letting yourself watch your own mind thinking. Have you ever done it? Maybe you haven't. Maybe you'd like to try. It's an incredible experience. She goes on to say, referring now to the voice of the silence, the halls or the voice of the silence, she says, we must flee the hall of learning, intellectual knowledge, to enter the hall of wisdom. What does that mean? It means you have to actually accept the fact that it is beyond the range and reach of human thought altogether. But somehow we have this substance or thing called intuition. And if we can raise our consciousness to the level where this is going to operate, we will get there. These beautiful words, I'm going to read them to you. Be mindful of your thought, your thoughts. Your thoughts become your words. Be mindful of your words. Your words become your actions. Be mindful of your actions. Your actions become your habits. Be mindful of your habits. Your habits become your character. Be mindful of your character. Your character becomes your destiny. It's been said that as a man thinks, so he is. It's a very profound statement. I don't think anyone can actually argue with it. I came across some words in the Te Deum. The Te Deum is one of the canticles in morning prayer in the Book of Common Prayer. Some words that I'd never noticed before, and which suddenly struck me as being incredibly relevant to this whole subject of God and what he's like, and trying to get a hold on it all. And it says, the Father of an infinite majesty. It's one of the lines of the Te Deum. I'd sung it or gone through it probably hundreds of times, but I'd never ever particularly noticed those words before. The Father of an infinite majesty. Although we're told we can find a little glimpse of the divine within ourselves if we go through the processes that are laid down in the right way, we've got to remember that out there, in here, everywhere, is an infinite majesty. A majesty so awesome and so unbelievable that no one could stand in its presence. So I'm going to read you this little something called the Invocation of Light. I got it many years ago. I can't remember quite where I got it from. O thou who bringest the dawn, who renewest the day without ceasing, whose splendour is the brightness of the morning, fountain of life and source of light eternal, increase in us thy knowledge and thy strength. Thou who shinest in the east, who showest the west thy glory, and art supreme in the high heaven. Thou fillest thy houses with the light, and thy mansions with hidden power. Thou sustainest the seven lords, the shining ones who keep thy path. And we who serve thee through their ray, O light ineffable, increase in us thy wisdom and thy power. Dwell in us as we are one in thee. Now I have nearly finished. I've only got one more thing to do, and I've got 1 minute left. I've got plus 1 minute. According to your clock, I've got plus 1 minute. I'm going to use it anyway. To tell you the source of this. This is a translation of the Lord's Prayer from Syriac Aramaic, which is possibly the closest existing version to the prayer that Jesus spoke. The translator, Neil Douglas Klotz, has attempted to maintain some of the Aramaic rhythms and nuances of meaning. And I close my talk regretfully, as I'd like much longer to say a lot more things. I haven't got it. The Lord's Prayer. O thou, the breath, the light of all, let this light create a heart shrine within. And your counsel will rule till oneness guides us all. Your one desire then acts with ours, as in all light, so in all forms. Grant what we need each day in bread and insight. Loose the cords of mistakes binding us as we release the strands we hold of others' faults. Don't let surface things delude us, but keep us from unripe acts. To you belongs the ruling mind, the life that can act and do, the song that beautifies all. From age to age it renews. In faith, I will to be true. Thank you.